Welcome to CSGuitars, the science of loud. Occasionally some unusual pedals come across my desk, and these two overdrives from exgear are a prime example of some unconventional design. They have sloped enclosures, which is something that hasn't been very popular since the early days of guitar pedals. All of the knobs have these grippy, rubberized coverings. The ring around the foot switch stays permanently illuminated when power is connected, allowing you to see where to stomp on a dark stage, and when the effect is engaged, the miniature knobs all illuminate, which I'll admit is a nice touch. And perhaps most bizarre of all is that the base plates on these are magnetised, allowing you to stick these to any ferrous metal. I'm assuming this is so that players using steel pedal boards can forego buying Velcro rather than anyone wanting to decorate their fridge door with guitar pedals, but to each their own. I didn't have any concept of how these would sound until I plugged them in and had a play around with them, and it's then when I discovered how different these sound. These are what I would term a vintage and a modern sounding distortion. Now when I say modern, I probably mean late 90s, early 2000s because I'm a damn millennial who can't let go and I'm terrified by a changing world of which I'm quickly losing all ability to control or comprehend. I recognise that the 90s is as modern to today's youth as the 60s was to me when I was a young'un, but I'm still going to refer to the 60s styled Grittman as vintage and the Krush as a turn of the millennium modern sound. Taking clues from the names and designs, I would imagine that the Grittman is basing itself around the Fender Bassman, which in turn was the blueprint for the original Marshall GTM Plexis. The Krush, on the other hand, is giving me some real Crank amp vibes. Now that might just be the K in the name, but Crank were very much of their time and one of the most cringeworthy mid-2000s companies I've ever come across. So what are the sonic differences here, and how can you tell the difference between a vintage and modern sounding distortion? Let's gain appreciation for these exgear pedals and find out. When it comes to vintage amplifier design, on which the sound of this is based, it was pretty uncomplicated by modern standards, all point-to-point wiring and pretty simple circuits. The way they were made meant that excessive tailoring of the sound wasn't possible, so you get a lot more frequencies being amplified, giving a bigger, more open sound. It was then up to the guitarist to be able to control that sound with their playing. Distortion on vintage amps wasn't as extreme as what you'd find 30 years later, and it was generated in a very different process. To get distortion out of a vintage amp, you simply have to make things really loud, turning up the amplifier until the signal destroys itself. Doing so meant that the sound of the distortion was untamed, gritty, spitty in the top end, and a little unpredictable. It's a nasty distortion sound, but with a lot of character. Also, amplifiers of this type would use valve rectification, and this, alongside the lack of signal sculpting, meant that you wouldn't get a tight, focused response, especially not in the low end. The sound would be a lot looser and would blow out when you hit hard. The Grittman emulates all of this reasonably well, being very open, loose, and unsurprisingly gritty. It has high and low gain modes, which I suppose are to try and replicate the two inputs you'd find on either a Bassman or Plexi, but don't be confused in thinking that high gain means metal here. It absolutely does not. For these vintage style sounds, high gain simply means more saturation and grit than before. Jump into the early 2000s and the sonic landscape has changed quite a bit. Processed, compressed and tight distortions are the order of the day. With advancements in electronics, modern amplifiers and effects could do far more to sculpt and tailor their sound. We're cutting out a lot of frequencies that we don't want while adding emphasis to the ones that we do. This provides a narrower field of view in the sonic spectrum, which might come across as sounding a bit thin, but really it's just more sculpted. Distortion levels have not only significantly increased, but they're being achieved in a different way. Attention is now on cascading the preamp to achieve the distortion prior to the amplifier getting loud, which allows for the distortion to stay clear and smooth. Gone are the grit and spit, and we've now got a far more streamlined, smoother distortion sound. Because the distortion of a modern amplifier was being purposefully generated in the preamp and the EQ tailoring was more apparent, the power amplification could be more precise. Solid-state rectification also assisted these amplifiers in sounding focused and tight, particularly in the low end. Krush carries forward that more controlled drive sound made apparent by the control labelled meat, which dials in the tightness in the low end. There's a smoother distortion here with a fair bit more gain, but it never goes to the insane metal levels. This is more of an early 2000s alt-rock vibe. Well, there you are, some unusual pedals and a brief examination of a couple of different eras of distortion. If you're interested in these and want to grab them for yourself, links are in the description under this video, and don't forget to click all the buttons you're supposed to make this video viable to the ever-changing whims of the YouTube algorithm. But that's all for now. Keep it loud and stay safe.